You may proceed now.
Thank you, Mr. President. If everybody is ready, Mr. President, Your Honours, as the prosecutor has indicated, I will now present a more in-depth explanation of the prosecution case and how we intend to prove that case. Each accused faced three counts of crimes against humanity, namely murder, deportation or forcible transfer of a population, and persecution, committed during the period 30th of December 2007 until 16th of January 2008. These charges relate to violence committed in 8 locations in the Rift Valley, more specifically in the districts of Uasin Gishu and Nandi. The specific locations in question are the towns of Turbo, Kapsabet, and Nandi Hills, and 5 locations in the Greater Eldoret area, namely Kiamba, Langas, Yamumbi, Haruma, and Kimumu. The map presently before the Chamber gives an indication of the location of the incidents within the districts of Uasin Gishu and Nandi, and their relative locations. These attacks covered a significant geographical spread and temporal scope. Your Honours, the evidence will establish that the attacks charged were not incidents of spontaneous violence. Rather, they were the result of careful planning. Nor was the violence random. The evidence will reveal that the targets of the attacks were specifically the Kikuyu population and other perceived PNU supporters, along with their homes and their businesses. This attests, Your Honours, to the discriminatory intent behind these crimes. The prosecution will present up to 22 victims and witnesses, common Kenyan people, who will describe the attacks on each of these locations. They will testify that the attacks were preceded by the sounding of the traditional Kalenjin Nderitu, or war cry. They will describe how large groups of Kalenjin youths, armed with traditional weapons such as bows and arrows, and many dressed for war, descended upon one location after another. Witnesses will testify how they saw large numbers of these youths ferried into certain locations by lorries. The attacks focused on areas known to be predominantly occupied by PNU supporters, mostly Kikuyu. In groups, and with the help of locals who lived in the areas, they identified and systematically torched houses and businesses belonging to PNU supporters and looted all their belongings. Kikuyu who were found were caught and attacked on sight with weapons such as arrows or pangas, and many were killed or gravely injured. Certain witnesses will also identify members and associates of the accused network as leading the attacks in Turbo Town, Kumumu, Kapsabet Town, and Nandi Hills Town. Others will testify that network members provided transport, food, and refreshment to the attackers. As a result of these attacks, at least 200 people were killed and over 1,000 injured. Tens of thousands were displaced. In one of the worst incidents at Kiamba, PNU supporters sought refuge in the Assemblies of God Church, a holy place where they expected to be safe. However, the attackers barricaded the victims inside this church and set it alight. Many of the occupants were trampled to death or burnt alive. Others who managed to escape the flames were hunted down and hacked to death. In total, between 17 and 35 people of all ages were killed. The first prosecution witness, witness 536, will testify about this incident. In the slide currently before the chamber, you can see the remains of bicycles which, amongst other objects, were used to barricade the doors of the church. Your Honours, the prosecution alleges that 2 of the men most responsible for these attacks are the 2 accused before court. Who then are the 2 accused? The first accused, Mr. William Ruto, was and is the anointed leader of the Kalenjin, and a powerful politician in the Rift Valley. This short video clip shows scenes of a ceremony at which this title was bestowed upon the accused. Note also the images of youths being ferried to the ceremony on the backs of lorries. Mr. Ruto had unsurpassed access to the community's resources, including manpower, funds, weapons, and transportation. These were all crucial for the implementation of the common plan, namely to resort to violent action in the event of an election loss. Until recently, Mr. Joshua Sang was the host of one of the, if not the most popular shows on Kalenjin radio station, Cass FM. This was the principal source of information and political discussion across the Rift Valley. He was therefore in the perfect position to help Mr. Ruto to build and control his network and to contribute to the execution of the common plan. Due to the enormous popularity of his show, Mr. Sang had carte blanche over the contents and the topics discussed on his program. Mr. Sang was fully aware of his influence over the community. He used that influence to steer public opinion in favor of Mr. Ruto and against the PNU. He placed his show at the disposal of the network for the furtherance of their plan. I'll return shortly to describe in more detail the nature of the common plan and the contribution of the accused. First, however, it is important to provide some context. In order to understand the accused's motive and opportunity to commit the crimes for which they are charged, it is necessary to have an insight into the political and historical background against which these crimes were committed, including the Kenyan political environment. This context will be provided through the evidence of, amongst others, the expert witness P464, who will examine the historical roots of the violence from a political, sociological, and anthropological perspective. The prosecution will also call two political overview witnesses, witnesses 326 and 323, and further insights will be provided by certain witnesses to the events in question who have direct knowledge of the perceptions of the population of the Rift Valley. Your Honours, historically, Kenyan politics has been heavily influenced by ethnic loyalties and tribal allegiances. Since independence, history has shown that the winning presidential candidate has tended to patronize members of his own tribe with land and other benefits. This system is sometimes described by political scientists as neo-patrimonialism. In basic terms, it is understood and acknowledged that people connected with the president, that is, belonging to the same tribe, are given preferential access to positions in government, land grants, better jobs, improved infrastructure for their districts, and contracts for the most lucrative business deals. I digress, Your Honours, to mention that I am aware that the term tribe may be regarded as some as being offensive, but this is the term that many of the witnesses use to describe their own and other ethnic groups in Kenya. And for this reason, the prosecution will also use it. Land, Your Honours, in particular, has always been a hotly contested issue in Kenya and in particular in the Rift Valley. The Kalenjin considered the Rift Valley to be their historical and ancestral homeland. In the years preceding independence and afterwards, Your Honours, a number of Kikuyu have resettled from Central Province to the Rift Valley. Many of them have benefited from the resettlement of colonial farms. Some of these farms had, in turn, been seized by the colonialists from earlier Kalenjin and Maasai occupants. Therefore, many Kalenjin resent the settlement of non-Kalenjin tribes in the Rift Valley and consider that they have misappropriated Kalenjin ancestral land. In 2005, Kenya held a constitutional referendum that raised the issues of land ownership and decentralization of power held by the executive branch of government. The Kikuyu and Kalenjin tribes took opposing positions on the referendum. 2007 presidential candidate Raila Odinga, supported by the Kalenjin, Luos, and other tribes, opposed the proposed constitutional amendment. To make it easy for people to vote, symbols were used, an orange for no and a banana for yes. After the success in opposing the referendum, Raila Odinga and other prominent no politicians, including the first accused, William Ruto, formed the Orange Democratic Party, named after the no symbol, the orange, commonly referred to as the ODM. And it is this party for which Mr. Ruto campaigned in 2007. In keeping with the orange position taken during the 2005 referendum, the ODM campaigned in the Rift Valley on a platform that strongly resonated with the Kalenjin ambition, that is, to control their province's natural and other resources and expel members of other tribes in order to reclaim lands, jobs, and property. This political philosophy is sometimes referred to in Kenya as Majimboism. The ODM and the PNU were two of the main parties which contested the 2007 the 2007 presidential elections. By the time campaigning for the 2007 elections had begun, Mr. William Ruto was the most influential politician in the Rift Valley. William Ruto and Joshua Sang knew what was at stake in these elections, namely real political power with all its attendant benefits for the winner and his supporters, and marginalization and disenfranchisement for the loser. Knowing this, the prosecution's evidence will show that Mr. Ruto created a network by enlisting other influential community leaders and supporters, including Kalenjin elders, youth leaders, ex-military personnel, businessmen, and importantly, Mr. Joshua Sang as the media spokesperson. The network's plan, repeated time and again at rallies and meetings, was war. In the event that power could not be obtained politically, then this network planned to use organized violence on an unprecedented scale to rid the Rift Valley of its political and ethnic opponents once and for all. Let me now briefly describe the structure of Mr. William Ruto's criminal organization. A network made up of influential Kalenjin associates, including Mr. Sang, and loyal, disenfranchised, and obedient Kalenjin youth. I should state at the outset that the criminal organization in question, which the prosecution has dubbed the network for ease of reference, was not a formal military or governmental body. It did not have formal ranks, officers, or letters of appointment. It did not keep formal records in the form of cabinet minutes, nor did it report its activities via military situation reports. Rather, this network was a criminal organization in the style of a mafia group or a triad organization, namely an association, in fact, of individuals connected by ethnic ties and a shared criminal purpose. None of this, however, means that it was any less real or any less organized. It had a clear hierarchy and chain of command, with Mr. Ruto at the apex. It displayed well-defined roles assigned to its members, all of whom contributed in one way or another to its ultimate goal, to rid the Rift Valley of its political and ethnic opponents. Your Honours, this diagram illustrates the various constituent elements of the network and various prominent members thereof, including the political element, financial element, military planners and strategists, media support from Mr. Sang significantly, and the tribal structures that provided support, manpower, and logistics. These various constituent parts of the network contributed as follows. Politically, Mr. Ruto's associates within the network included prominent and influential local politicians and community leaders. They gave their endorsement to the plan by appearing at public rallies and supporting Mr. Ruto's rhetoric, as well as contributing to his war chest. Financially, the network received funding from wealthy Kalenjin businessmen and community foundations. And Mr. Ruto personally contributed his own money to ensure the common plan was implemented handing out cash to those who attended meetings, and pledging rewards to those who killed perceived PNU supporters or destroyed their properties. Militarily, the network's hierarchical structure had a chain of command and system of reporting. It included ex-security servicemen appointed to coordinate and oversee the execution of the attacks, the names of whom appear on this slide. Reporting to these so-called commanders were divisional leaders, and under them, thousands of Kalenjin youth enlisted to perpetrate the violence itself. As I've already mentioned, Mr. Joshua Sang was a key collaborator and the media spokesman. Finally, and crucially, the network drew on existing tribal structures to strengthen and legitimize its existence and objective. Traditional Kalenjin elders endorsed and blessed Mr. Ruto as their leader in 2006, as we've just seen. They exploited traditional circumcision and oathing ceremonies of Kalenjin youth in order to indoctrinate and train large numbers of warriors before the elections. They contributed funding and recruited youth to take part in the attacks. They helped to corral people to the preparatory meetings and acted as watchdogs in their community to ensure the participation of every Kalenjin male in those areas, meting out punishment to those who did not support William Ruto and his party. Punishments included public humiliation, flogging, and forcing them to pay penance in livestock, some of which were used to feed warriors on the ground. And after the violence, they performed cleansing ceremonies to absolve youth involved in the crimes of any crimes they had committed. Therefore, Your Honours, while it may not have resembled a traditional state or state-like organization, this ad hoc network nevertheless satisfies the requirements of an organization for the purposes of the contextual elements required for crimes against humanity. It had the means to carry out organized, large-scale attacks which infringed upon basic human values. And it executed the plan on the instruction of Mr. William Ruto, when the party that Mr. Ruto supported lost the 2007 elections. The common plan that I've just described did not spring up overnight. It was carefully created over a period of nearly 18 months prior to the elections. The plan was developed and implemented in a series of small and large planning meetings and public rallies, starting in mid-2006 and continuing right through to January 2008. The meetings and rallies occurred in many areas, including Mr. Ruto's home in Samoei, and in the locations where the attacks later took place: Eldoret, Turbo, Kapsabet, and Nandi Hills. The slide before the chamber now depicts the locations of various meetings and the rallies that were held, including those held at Mr. Ruto's Samoei home. Witnesses who were present at certain of these meetings and these rallies will describe what they saw and heard, including members of the network planning and organizing to permanently rid the Rift Valley of the Kikuyu and other perceived PNU supporters. In the lead-up to the election, Mr. Ruto, as the leader of the Kalenjin, was the main speaker at a number of large rallies. This short clip depicts Mr. Ruto addressing one of the many rallies preceding the election.
Your Honour, I wonder, is sound going to be played? I would ask that it would be played.
I do not propose to play sound, Your Honours, mainly because they're not in English.
You may proceed.
Thank you. Let me make it clear, in case my learned friend misunderstands me. I do not allege that what was said by Mr. Ruto at this particular rally, in this particular clip, constitutes evidence of the crimes we allege. The evidence which the prosecution will lead, however, will demonstrate that these were not merely innocent election rallies. He and his fellow speakers used them as a platform to complain to his Kalenjin audience about the unfairness of long-standing and deep-rooted tribal issues. Mr. Ruto repeatedly told his Kalenjin audience how land and employment opportunities were wrongfully appropriated by the Kikuyu and others who did not belong in the Rift Valley. He warned them that without vigilance, the upcoming election would be rigged, and declared directly or through the use of parables that non-ODM supporters should be evicted from the Rift Valley, saying, for instance, that they were weeds which needed to be removed. Witnesses will also testify how Mr. Ruto consistently referred to Kikuyu using derogatory terms like madoa-doa, meaning spots or stains, saying that these spots or stains must be removed from the Rift Valley. And you will hear that Mr. Sang, for his part, advertised the time and place of these rallies, encouraging large crowds of people to attend. In addition to these public rallies, smaller private meetings were held as early as June 2006. The first meeting was held at Mr. Ruto's home in Sugoi, on the outskirts of Turbo, which was the first area to be attacked by the network. Witnesses who attended these meetings will tell the Chamber that the agenda for these meetings was war. Furthermore, Mr. Sang and Mr. Ruto and others espoused anti-Kikuyu and anti-PNU rhetoric, arranged for the logistics necessary to carry out the attacks, namely funds, transportation, weapons, food and communications, etc. At other meetings, people were designated to call into Mr. Sang's radio show to express their support for ODM and for Mr. Ruto and to denigrate the PNU. Areas densely populated with Kikuyu and other PNU supporters were identified for attack. Locals familiar with the area were appointed to lead the attacks and to identify Kikuyu-owned property and businesses. At these meetings, village leaders were also instructed to hold local meetings to maximize the reach of the network's message of hate, and hence the number of people who would later respond to the call to drive out the Kikuyu from the Rift Valley. Immediately preceding and during the violence, local network commanders and youth congregated on the outskirts of the targeted locations in order to organize and coordinate attacks to ensure success. What then was the contribution of the accused to all of this? Mr. Ruto used his political and tribal authority and the traditional obedience and the tradition of obedience of the Kalenjin to their leaders to promote and impose the objectives of the common plan on the Kalenjin community. As I have already explained in some detail, he utilized political campaigns, public events, and private gatherings, as well as the media, to exploit the community's historic grievance and to plant the seeds that the PNU would steal or otherwise rig the elections. As the founder and leader of the network, he was the ultimate controlling hand behind the common purpose. In this way, he made an essential contribution to the common plan. Additionally, however, Mr. Ruto made a number of other essential contributions, such as supplying weapons and contributing finances and other necessities for the implementation of the attacks. Mr. Sang contributed to the common plan and ultimately to the crimes by placing his show Lene Emet at the disposal of the network. Mr. Sang was the voice of the post-election violence in the Rift Valley. He fanned the violence by spreading hate messages against Kikuyu and announcing that the election would be and then had been rigged. He himself attended certain planning meetings, so he knew very well what the ultimate aim of the spreading of anti-Kikuyu rhetoric was. Furthermore, he was on notice regarding the impropriety of broadcasting these types of messages, as his radio station had previously been sanctioned after the 2005 referendum for broadcasting hate speech. Mr. Sang also provided Mr. Ruto with a platform by which he himself could regularly address the entire Kalenjin community. He took calls from persons specifically designated by the network to spread its views and to serve its objectives. He promoted and reported on rallies and meetings, and significantly, he encouraged the network's perpetrators to participate in the attacks and directed them to designated target locations. On the strength of these contributions, both accused bear criminal responsibility under the Rome Statute and under international law. This evidence, if accepted by the Chamber, will make it very clear as well that the two accused had the necessary criminal intent required for conviction of the crimes charged. As the prosecutor mentioned earlier in her introduction, the ultimate aim of Mr. Ruto and his network was to drive his political opponents from the Rift Valley by violent means, to secure personal political power, and to consolidate Mr. Ruto's voter base in the Kalenjin community. By destroying the homes of his opponents and the use of extreme violence in combination, he and his network drove over 35,000 mainly Kikuyu victims from the two areas of the Rift Valley concerned. And perhaps at this stage I should just correct an inadvertent slip of the prosecutor. The number of estimated victims was not 200 to 4,000, but 200 to 400,000 in the Rift Valley alone. The clips which are now being shown to the court demonstrate firstly a makeshift IDP camp at the Turbo police station where many Kikuyu fled for safety. And the second clip is a more formal IDP camp set up at the Eldoret Showgrounds. We seem to have lost that one. Press backspace and see if that happens. I think I will just proceed. It's not that important. Your Honours, these images bear mute testimony to the effectiveness of the accused's common plan to forcibly remove political opponents from the area. I think I'm going to make it, Your Honours. Your Honours, the defence will have you believe that the post-election violence in the Rift Valley was not, in fact, the product of prior planning by the accused and his network, but rather the spontaneous response of the population to what they perceived as election fraud. They will allege that the prosecution's evidence to the contrary is a fabrication, and that many of the prosecution's witnesses have engaged in an elaborate conspiracy. They will point to alleged inducements offered to witnesses, whether by the prosecution or some other yet-to-be-identified third party, in order to falsely lay the blame at the feet of the accused. Indeed, the defense are obliged to do so, since the evidence against them, if accepted, is compelling. They are also obliged to point to some guiding hand behind the scenes in order to explain how such a disparate group of individuals could be persuaded to unite behind this shadowy scheme. The prosecution expects, although we don't know, as we have not yet been disclosed the defense's witness list, we expect the defense will rely on certain former prosecution witnesses who have now recanted their written statements, statements which they signed and confirmed the truth of, but who now allege that they were induced by members of the prosecution or other as yet unnamed parties to falsely implicate the accused. They allege in statements and in the media that sudden bouts of conscience have moved them to renounce their former versions and come clean. However, the prosecution will, if necessary, present evidence as to the true motives behind their actions, and that is that they have been bribed to do so. However, Your Honours, the Chamber should not allow itself to be distracted from the evidence before it. Your Honours will in due course determine whether or not the witnesses are truthful and reliable. To conclude then, Mr. President, Your Honours, the prosecution will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the two accused, Mr. William Ruto and Mr. Joshua Sang, are criminally responsible for the attacks in Turbo, Greater Eldoret area, Kapsabet and Nandi Hills, and that they should be declared guilty of the crimes charged against them. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Steynberg. Before we rise, of course, I did not want to interrupt your flow, but I was rather attracted by the caveat you issued as regards the word tribe. If you learned that not too long ago the word was described in an eminent dictionary as an aggregate collection of a primary people living in barbarous conditions under a headman or chief. Perhaps you might accept that ethnic group might be a better word to use, despite what your clients say.
I accept your Honour's admonition, but I'm afraid I will not be able to control the terms used by the witnesses. They will use their own terms. But
Fair enough, fair enough.
For myself, I think I can manage to use the term you've indicated. Thank you, Your Honour.
Mr. Khan, you will be prepared to proceed at 11:30. I take it?
Your Honour, unless the victim's representative goes first, and then perhaps I'm prepared to stand at any time.
Fair enough. And in that case, Ms. Nderitu, you'll go next?
Yes, I will be next after the break.
Thank you very much. So we will now rise for 30 minutes.
On rise, veuillez vous lever.